The body on the table was still breathing. That was the first surprise to our Velk. Had seen many bodies come through the emergency bay of Station Kepler 9. He had seen Drenathi warriors with half their chest caved in. He had seen Polari sailors burned from the inside out by engine plasma. He had seen things that no living creature should survive. But he had never seen anything like this. The human had fallen from the upper deck of a mining freighter, 300 feet, straight down onto a metal cargo platform. The ship had then partially collapsed on top of her. She had been buried under 2 tons of twisted iron and broken pipe for 6 hours before the rescue team found her, and she was still breathing. Her name was Sergeant Dara Miles, age 31. Species human. Origin Earth. She was part of a small crew working the asteroid belts near KEPLER 442. The freighter had suffered a catastrophic pressure failure. Most of the crew made it to the escape pods. Dara did not. Nobody knew why she stayed. Nobody had asked her yet. She arrived at the station on a stretcher made from emergency foam and broken hull plating. Her left arm was shattered in 4 places. 3 ribs on her right side had punched inward. There was bleeding in her skull. Her lower spine had taken a direct impact that would have simply ended most other species, but her heart was beating. Dr. Velk moved fast. He was a Thranosi, which meant his body had 6 limbs and a mind that worked like a machine. Thranosi did not panic. They did not feel fear in the way softer species did. They simply calculated and moved. Right now, every calculation he ran said this human should already be dead, and yet the numbers kept being wrong, and so he kept moving. The surgical bay hummed to life around him. 2 medical drones took position on either side of the table. Nursetti, a young Polari with silver-gray skin and 4 slender arms, began cutting away the remains of Dara's uniform. The surgical AI known as Caduceus activated its scanning array and began building a full map of the patient's internal condition. Velk scrubbed his upper hands and looked at the first scan results. The damage was severe, but survivable, barely. He began prioritizing. The skull bleed had to stop first. Then the ribs needed to be pulled back before they punctured the lung completely. Then the arm. Then they could assess the spine. He gave the order, and the team moved for 40 minutes. The bay was nothing but quiet, focused work. Instruments passing between hands. The soft sound of the AI calling out pressure levels and blood counts. The occasional beep of a monitor adjusting. Velk did not speak unless he needed to. His team knew what to do. Then Caduceus stopped, not fully. The machines kept running. But the AI went silent in a way it never did during surgery. A pause that lasted 3 full seconds, which for a medical AI was an eternity. Then it spoke. A known biological structure detected. Located posterior to the adrenal complex. Adjacent to lumbar vertebrae 2 and 3. No match found in human anatomical database. No match found in galactic species registry. Classification unknown. Recommend immediate removal to prevent surgical complication. Vig did not stop what he was doing. He finished closing the bleed in the skull, and then he looked at the scan. There it was, nestled between the adrenal glands and the lower spine, like something that had always been there and never wanted to be noticed. A dense dark red mass of tissue, roughly the size of a clenched human fist. It had a texture unlike anything in the surrounding anatomy. Where the adrenal glands were smooth and clean, this thing looked almost braided, like thousands of tiny fibers wound around each other so tightly they had become one solid object. It had its own blood vessels. Not borrowed ones. Its own? A private network running directly from the aorta. The body was giving this organ priority blood supply. The same priority it gave the brain and the heart. Vake stared at it for a long moment. Seti leaned in and looked at the same image. Her 4 hands went still. She said nothing, but her silver skin flushed pale, which was how Polari showed they were unsettled. Remove, it said. Caduceus again. Unknown tissue presents surgical risk. Vake did not remove. I did not know why exactly. It was not logic. Thranosi were supposed to run on logic. But something in the scan held him. The organ was not diseased. It was not foreign. It was not a tumor or an infection or a parasite. The surrounding tissue showed no signs of rejection. The body was not fighting this thing, the body was feeding. I've made the call. Leave it in place. Mark it. Continue. They finished the surgery 2 hours later. Dara's skull bleed was sealed. Her ribs were reset and supported with a bone lattice scaffold. Her arm was pinned. The spinal damage was worse than expected, and she would need 3 weeks of regenerative treatment before she could walk properly. But she was stable, she was alive after the surgery. Velk stood at the observation window looking at her through the glass. She was small by most species standards. Humans always looked smaller when they were unconscious. When they were awake, they had a way of taking up more space than their bodies should allow. Something in the way they moved or looked at things. Right now she was just small and pale and very still. CAD-UC-US generated its post-surgery report and sent it to his console. At the bottom, under unresolved items, the AI had flagged the organ again. It had run the scan 3 more times during the surgery, trying to find a match in its database. It had searched human medical records going back 200 years of Galactic Union documentation. Zero matches. No human doctor had ever named this organ. No alien medical team had ever cataloged it. In 200 years of humans traveling through Galactic Union space and being treated in Union hospitals, not one record mentioned this structure. Velk read that line. Twice 200 years. He looked back through the glass at Dara Miles lying perfectly, still on the other side. Her chest rose and fell slowly. The machines around her beeped in steady rhythm. He opened a channel to the research division of the station and requested an immediate consultation with xenobiologist. Researcher Umasthin. He looked at the scan one more time. The organ sat exactly where it had always been, dark, dense, quiet, fed by its own private rivers of blood, doing something, waiting for something. Nobody knew what, and somehow that felt like the most dangerous sentence Velk had ever thought in his long medical career. The first thing Dara Miles did when she woke up was ask for coffee. Not where am I, not what happened, not am I alive. She opened her eyes, looked at the pale blue ceiling of the medical bay, and said in a dry, cracked voice, can somebody please get me a coffee? Nurse Seti, who had been sitting quietly at the monitoring station, dropped her datapad. She had treated humans before, 3 of them over her career. She thought she understood them reasonably well. She did not. She picked up the datapad and pressed the alert button that told Dr. Velk the patient was conscious. Dara turned her head slowly and looked around the room. She took in the equipment. The drones parked in the corner, the wide observation window, the soft hum of the ventilation system, the silver-skinned 4-armed nurse staring at her like she had just done something impossible. She simply did not know it yet. How long? Said Dara. 3 days, replied Seti carefully. Dara nodded like this was acceptable information. She tried to move her left arm and found it held in a rigid support frame. She looked at it without any particular emotion. Then she looked at her right side, where a faint pressure told her the rib scaffold was still in place. She pressed 2 fingers against it gently, winced slightly, nodded again. Where is the rest of my crew? She said. Safe, said Seti. All escape pods recovered. No fatalities besides the structural loss of the freighter. Dara closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, something in her face had settled, like a knot had been untied somewhere behind her expression. Good, she said. That is good. Then Dr. Velk walked in. He was tall even for a Thranosi. His upper 2 limbs were folded behind him in the formal posture that meant he was thinking seriously about something. His compound eyes moved over Dara with the precise attention of a creature that cataloged everything it looked at. He said, Sergeant Miles, I need to discuss something with you. About your surgery. Dara looked at him and said, Sure, Doc. Also, I am serious about the coffee. Velk did not know what coffee was. He made a note to find out later. Right now, he pulled the scan results up on the wall display beside her bed and turned the screen so she could see it. Clearly, this is an image of your lower torso, he said, taken during surgery. I want you to look at this structure here. He highlighted the organ. The dark braided mass glowed faintly on the screen in the blue light of the imaging system. Dara looked at it. Then she looked at Velthin. She looked back at the screen. Yeah, she said. What about it? Velk paused. He had prepared for several possible reactions: confusion, fear, curiosity, denial. He had not prepared for yeah, what about it? Can you tell me what it is? He said. Dara squinted at the screen. She tilted her head a little, which pulled slightly at her ribs and made her wince again. Is that not just like normal stuff? She said. Connective tissue or something? It is not, said Velk. It has its own blood supply. It draws 4% of your total metabolic energy. It has a unique cellular structure that does not match any other tissue in your body. It is not connective tissue. It is not scar formation. It is not a cyst or a growth or a parasite. It is a fully developed functioning organ that your body is actively prioritizing. Dara stared at the screen for a long moment. She said that was all. Just Velk felt something he rarely felt. He felt unsteady, and he was standing perfectly still on all four lower limbs, which should have made unsteady impossible. You have never been told about this, he said. No doctor, no medical examination. No record. Dara shook her head slowly. Look, she said, I have had maybe 6 medical scans in my life. Mostly field checks. Nothing deep. Humans are not exactly rushing to hospitals all the time. We kind of just deal with things. She said this last part like it was obvious. Like it was not a sentence that should concern. Velk stared at her, then he turned around and walked directly to the research wing without another word. Researcher Umis was already deep in the records when he arrived. She was a Polari like Seti, but older. Her silver skin had gone slightly gray at the edges, and her 4 eyes had the particular intensity of someone who had been awake for too long and did not care. She had surrounded herself with floating data screens, and every single one of them was showing a human medical scan. She had pulled every human record in the Galactic Union database. Every scan taken at every Union hospital in 200 years. 1,214 individual records. She turned to Velk when he walked in, and her voice was quieted. Is in all of them, she said. Every single scan. Every human who had ever been treated in a Union hospital. Young, old, male, female, large, small. Every planet of origin. Every occupation. The organ was present in all 1,214 records. In not one of those records had any doctor, human or alien, ever noted it. 200 years, said Umis again. She said it the way someone says a number when they cannot quite believe it is real. It has been hiding, she said. Not on purpose. Nobody was hiding it. It was simply overlooked. Alien doctors assumed it was connective structure. Human doctors never looked closely enough. And the organ just sat there in every human body, doing whatever it does. And nobody ever asked if Velk sat down, which was not something he did often. He pulled up the comparative data Umis had started building. She had flagged something already. Something in the size variance between records. The organ was not the same size in every human. It was larger in some, smaller in others. She had started cross-referencing the size variation with the medical history. Notes attached to each file. The pattern she had found was not yet complete, but it was already strange enough to make Velk sit very still and read it 3 times. The organ was largest in humans, who had survived the worst things, not the strongest humans, not the youngest or the healthiest. The ones who had been through the most loss, disaster, moments that should have ended them and did know. Looked at the scan of Dara Miles. Her organ was one of the largest in the entire dataset. She did not even know it existed. Velk looked at Umis, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because sometimes the most frightening discoveries are the ones that were always there, right in front of you, waiting for someone to finally pay attention. Researcher Umis did not sleep for 4 days. This was not unusual for Polari during a significant discovery. Their biology allowed for extended focus periods where the body simply refused to shut down until the mind had found what it was looking for. Her colleagues brought her food twice a day. She ate without looking at the plates. She drank water when someone put it directly in her hand. She did not look away from her screens. She was building a picture. The dataset was 1,214 humans. The cross-referencing was slow because human medical records were not kept in any consistent format. Humans use 17 different documentation systems across their settlements, and not all of them translated cleanly into Galactic Union standard. Some records were detailed. Some were barely more than a name and a species notation. Umi's worked through all of them. By the end of the first day, she had confirmed the size variance pattern. The organ was larger in humans who had experienced more extreme life events. But larger did not mean damaged. It did not mean stressed or overworked. The tissue in larger organs was denser, more developed, like a muscle that had been used and grown stronger from the use. By the end of the second day, she had found something else. The organ had activity markers, not electrical ones like the brain, not chemical ones like the adrenal glands. These were cellular. The organ left microscopic traces in the surrounding tissue every time it activated, like footprints. And those footprints had timestamps because cellular decay followed predictable patterns. She could see when the organ had last fired in each patient. She cross-referenced those timestamps with the medical notes. The organ activated during near-death events. That was the first match. Every human in the dataset who had a recorded near-death experience showed a massive activity spike in the organ at the estimated time of the event. The footprints were enormous, deep, like the organ had thrown everything it had. But it was not only near-death events, it also activated during grief. Not the quiet, slow grief of ordinary loss, but the sharp, sudden kind. The moment someone was told someone they loved was gone. The organ fired at that moment and kept firing for hours, sometimes days afterward. It activated during what the human medical notes described as moments of sudden courage. A crew member who ran back into a burning section of a ship. A parent who lifted a collapsed structure off a child. A soldier who stood in front of others when standing meant being the one who got hit. In every case, the organ had fired seconds before the action was taken, and then Umi's found the strangest category. Of all the organ activated when humans made decisions they believed might end them, but made those decisions anyway, not impulsive decisions. Not accidents, deliberate ones. Humans who chose to stay when they could have left. Humans who chose to fight when retreat was the logical option. Humans who looked at a situation that said you will not survive this and then stepped forward into it anyway. Every single time the organ had fired, First Uma sat back and looked at her screens and thought about what she was seeing. Every species in the Galactic Union had something that helped them survive. The Thranosi had pure computational cognition. In a crisis, they calculated faster than any organic mind in the galaxy. The Dranathi had collective memory, meaning every individual had access to the survival knowledge of their entire species' history. The Kellari had a secondary nervous system that numbed pain almost completely in emergency situations. Every species had something, but what humans had was different. Every other species' survival mechanism worked by making the crisis smaller, making the fear smaller, making the pain smaller, making the math work out in their favor. The human organ did not make the crisis smaller. It fired in the middle of the full weight of the crisis. After the fear, after the pain, after the math had already said no. It activated when everything was already as bad as it was going to get, and then it pushed the human forward anyway. Umis pulled up the neurochemical data she had extracted from the organ samples taken during Dara's surgery. Valk had saved a small tissue sample against Caduceus' recommendation, and she was grateful for it. Now the organ produced chemicals. 8 distinct compounds. 4 of them were completely unidentified and not present in any galactic biological database. The other 4 were variants of compounds found in human brain chemistry, but supercharged, amplified to levels that should have been toxic but somehow were not. She ran a simulation of what those chemicals would do when released into a human bloodstream. All at once, the simulation results made her go very still. Clarity, she said quietly to herself. The chemicals produced absolute mental clarity. They did not remove fear. The fear signals in the brain showed up clearly in the simulation. The chemicals did not touch the fear. They simply built something louder on top of it. A focused, narrow tunnel of pure intention. The body still knew it was afraid. The body still knew it was in danger. But the organ gave it something that felt more important in that moment than either of those things. The will to move forward anyway she called Velk arrived within minutes, and she showed him everything. He stood at her screens and read through the data without speaking. His compound eyes moved quickly. He read everything twice. She waited, then he said, "I need to contact the Galactic Medical Congress." She nodded. She had been thinking the same thing. He said, "I am going to request an emergency session. Full attendance. This cannot wait for a standard review cycle." She asked how long the Congress would take to convene. He said, "Given what we have here, 3 weeks at most. I will make them understand the urgency." He sent the request that evening. He attached a summary of the findings. He labeled it Priority Level 1, which was a classification he had never used before in his career. Priority Level 1 was reserved for discoveries that had the potential to fundamentally change how the Galactic Union understood life. He believed this qualified across 40 star systems. The message arrived in the offices and laboratories and research halls of the most respected medical minds in the galaxy. They read the summary. They looked at the scans. They looked at the data, and one by one they all sent back the same reply: "We are coming." Meanwhile, in the medical bay, Dara Miles had finally gotten her coffee. SETI had looked up what it was and synthesized something close enough. Dara sat up in her bed with the warm cup in her one good hand and watched news feeds from the outer belt on a small screen mounted beside her. She did not know that 40 of the greatest scientific minds in the known galaxy were currently boarding ships to come and look at something inside her body. She did not know that in research labs and academic halls across the galaxy her name was already being spoken in the same sentence as words like unprecedented and impossible and never seen. Before she finished her coffee, she asked for another one, and somewhere in the deep quiet of her lower back, pressed between old bone and living tissue, the dark braided organ sat exactly where it had always been, patient, dense, full of chemicals that had no name yet, waiting for the next time it would be needed. It had been waiting her entire life. It was very good at waiting. The Congress Hall on Station Kepler 9 had not been used in 11 years. The last time it was opened was for the announcement of the Dranathi Peace Accord. Before that, it was the discovery of a new sentient species in the outer spiral. It was a room built for moments that mattered. High curved walls of dark alloy. Rows of seating arranged in a wide arc facing a central platform. Translation nodes embedded in every seat so that 40 different languages could be heard simultaneously by 40 different species in the same breath. 43 delegates had come, some in person, some through quantum projection. The Dranathi Elder Counselor Het had come in person, which surprised everyone. The Dranathi were ancient and did not travel lightly. For Het to board a ship and come to a small medical station in the Kepler belt meant he had read the summary and decided this was worth his time. That alone told every other delegate in the room that what they were about to hear was real. The Velk stood at the central platform. He was not a speaker by nature. Thranosi communicated in precise bursts, not long flowing speeches. But he had prepared carefully. He had spent 3 days organizing the data into a presentation that would be clear to every species in the room, regardless of their scientific background. He began at the beginning. He told them about the crash, about Dara Miles, about the surgery and the moment Caduceus flagged the unknown structure. He showed them the original scan, the dark braided mass sitting quietly between the adrenal glands and the spine. He told them about the blood supply priority, about the 200-year gap in the records, about every human in the database carrying this thing and no one ever stopping to ask what it was. The hall was silent. Not the polite silence of an audience being patient. The deep silence of minds that were genuinely stopped. Then he handed over to Umis, who walked through the data. She was a better speaker than Valk. She had a Polari gift for making complex things feel simple. She took them through the size variants, the activity markers, the cross-referencing with life events. She showed them the neurochemical analysis. She ran the simulation on the main screen so they could all watch what the organ did to a human body when it fired. When the simulation ended, nobody moved for a moment. Then the questions started. They came fast and from every direction. The Killary medical delegate asked about dosage thresholds for the unidentified compounds. The Thrinosi Academy representative asked about the organ development timeline in human children. The Miran collective sent 3 simultaneous questions through their projection. Note about evolutionary originamus and Valk answered what they could. They said honestly when they did not yet know. There was a lot they did not yet know. Then Counselor Het raised one of his long gray hands. The room went quiet immediately. When a Dranathi elder asked to speak, you listened. Not out of politics? Out of the understanding that Dranathi had been alive long enough to see patterns that younger species had not yet had time to notice, he said in his low, slow voice. You have shown us what the organ does in data. You have shown us the chemistry and the timing and the patterns. But data is a map. A map is not the place itself. Before we decide what this organ is, I think we should ask the human what the place feels like from inside everyone. Looked at Valk had anticipated this. He nodded to Seti, who was standing at the side door. She opened it and Dara Miles walked in. She was moving better now. 2 weeks of regenerative treatment had done a great deal for her spine and her ribs. She still held her left arm slightly close to her body out of habit, even though the scaffold was gone. She walked to the central platform and looked out at 43 alien faces. Looking back at her, and she did not flinch, Vake said, Sergeant Miles, these delegates would like to understand your experience. Specifically, I want you to think about the worst moments of your life. The moments where you were most afraid, where the situation was most impossible. And I want you to describe what happened inside you right before you acted. Dara looked at him. She looked at the delegates. She looked at the ceiling briefly like she was searching for something up there. Then she said, okay, she told them about the freighter crash. She said when the deck gave way, she felt the fall and her mind went completely white. Not blank, white, like everything else turned off and there was only one thing left. She said she did not decide to grab the support beam on the way down. Her hand just took it. She did not tell her hand to do that. Something else did. She told them about her brother. He had died when she was 19. An accident in a construction site back on Earth. She said when her mother called her with the news, she felt like the floor disappeared. Like there was nothing under her. And then something came up from somewhere below her stomach, and it was not strength exactly, and it was not calm exactly. It was just forward. She said she could not explain it better than that. Something that said forward. And she went forward. She got on a transport and went home and held her mother and arranged the burial and got back on her ship and kept living. She told them about the time a fire broke out in the crew quarters of her second posting. A junior crew member was trapped behind a sealed door. Dara said she knew the door would be hot. She knew her hands would burn. She said for 1 second she felt everything. The heat, the fear, the absolute certainty that this was a bad idea. And then she said it was like a switch. She said, I know that sounds simple, but that is the only word I have. 1 second I was afraid, and the next second there was this switch. And after the switch, the fear was still there, but it was behind something. And I just went through the door. The hall was completely silent. Then Counselor Het spoke again. His voice was even quieter than before. He said, I am 412 years old. I have watched 17 species navigate extinction events. I have studied courage as a philosophical concept for 2 centuries. And I want to tell you what I have just understood sitting in this room today. He paused. He said every species survives through something they were given: instinct, calculation, numbers, pack loyalty, physical adaptation. We survive because our design allows it, but we do not choose our design. We were given it and we use. I've looked at Dara. He said, you are the only species I have ever encountered that has a biological system whose entire purpose is to make you choose. Not to remove the fear, not to eliminate the pain, not to make the situation easier. But to make it possible for you to choose to go forward anyway, while still feeling all of I said that is not just survival, he said that is something else. Enter Leomis was writing. Her hands were shaking slightly. She looked up and said, "Then what do we call it?" Het looked at Dara for a long moment. Then he said, "Call it the will." Glad the room did not erupt. There was no applause. It was too big a moment for noise. It settled over the hall like something heavy and warm. Like the moment after a very long question finally receives its answer. Dara stood on the platform and heard them name something inside her that she had never known existed, and her eyes went bright and wet, and she looked down at her own hands, and she did not say anything at all, because there are moments when the only honest response to something enormous is silence. 3 months after the Congress, the Galactic Union did something it had never done in its 400-year history. It reopened a closed case. The case was called the Velhari Collapse. It was 160 years old. The Velhari had been a species of roughly 4 million individuals living on 2 planets in the mid-spiral. They were intelligent. They were organized. They had agriculture and cities and a written language and a functioning government. By every measure, they should have survived the meteor event that struck their primary planet. The event was devastating but not unsurvivable. Estimates showed the Velhari had enough resources to rebuild, enough population to recover, enough knowledge to adapt, but they did not. Within 40 years of the impact, the Velhari were gone. Not killed by the meteor. Not killed by disease or starvation directly. The record showed they simply stopped. The farms were abandoned while there was still soil. The cities were left while there were still walls standing. The last recordings of Velhari communication showed a species that had looked at the scale of what needed to be done, and had decided it could not be done, and had laid down. At the time, the Union had classified it as resource failure. A tragedy, but an understandable one. Now a research team led by Umis reclassified it. It was not resource failure. It was biological. The Velhari, like every other species in the Union, had no will gland. They had reason. They had instinct. They had community bonds. But they had no organ whose sole purpose was to fire when everything said stop and push the individual forward anyway. When the crisis became large enough, their biology had no answer for it. The moment the situation exceeded what their survival instincts could process, they stopped. And they never started again. Umis published the findings in the Union Medical Journal. It was the most read paper in the history of that publication within 2 weeks of release. Research teams on 40 worlds began pulling their own historical records looking for the same pattern. They found it. Again and again. Species that had disappeared or drastically declined. Species that had survived near extinction but only barely. The line between them was not always resources or technology or military strength. Sometimes the line was simply this: did they have something inside them that fired when everything else said? No. Humans were the only species that did. The Union Species Registry was updated quietly. No ceremony. No announcement. The change was made in a standard administrative update that went out on a Tuesday morning in Galactic Standard Time. Most of the galaxy did not notice it for a week. Sergeant Dara Miles' species classification was changed from Tier 3 primitive biological to Tier 1 anomalous. Handle with studied respect. When Valk showed her the update, she stared at it for a long time. Then she said, "What does handle with studied respect mean exactly?" "It means," said Valk, "that the Union has formally acknowledged it does not fully understand what you are capable of and has decided the appropriate response is careful attention rather than assumptions." Dara thought about this. She said, "That is the nicest way anyone has ever told me they find me confusing." Valk made a sound that was the Thernosi equivalent of a laugh. It sounded like 2 small stones clicking together. He had not made that sound in a very long time. 2 weeks later, the Union offered Dara a formal position. Human biological liaison. First of her kind. She would work between the Medical Research Division and the human settlements in the Outer Belt. Help bridge the gap that 400 years of overlooking a single organ had created between humanity and the rest of the galaxy she accepted on her last evening before leaving the station. She sat in the observation bay with Dr. Valk. It was a small room at the end of the medical wing with a wide curved window that looked out directly into open space. The stars out there were very still, very far, very old. They sat for a while without talking. Valk was not a creature of comfortable silence normally. Silence meant nothing was being calculated, and nothing being calculated felt like waste. But he had found that time spent near Dara Miles had changed some of his habits slightly. She was good at silence. She did not seem to feel the need to fill it after a while. He said, I have been thinking about something since the Congress. She looked at him. He said, every species we know of that has faced extinction level events has left records, communications, logs, testimonies, and there is a phrase that appears in almost all of them across almost all species. It appears in the last stages, when things were worst. The phrase in various translations always means roughly the same thing. He paused. He said, we could not go on. Dara said nothing. She was listening. He said, I have searched human records from your worst historical periods. Your wars, your plagues, your collapses, your extinction close calls. The phrase appears in human records too. Humans wrote it. Humans said it. We could not go on. He looked at her. He said, and then they did. The stars outside the window did not move. Space was indifferent. It did not care about congresses or reclassifications or organs with no name for 200 years. It simply continued being what it was. Dara looked out at it for a long time. Then she said quietly, I do not think we ever really knew why we kept going. I do not think any of us sat down and made a decision. It was not heroic from the inside. It never felt like courage. It just felt like the next thing. You do the next thing because it is there to be done. You go forward because forward is the only direction that has anything in it. She paused. She said, maybe that is what the organ does. Maybe it does not make us brave. Maybe it just makes forward feel more real than stopping. Vake was quiet for a moment, then he opened his research log. He had been keeping a personal entry throughout the 3 months since the discovery. He typed one final note at the bottom of the file. He wrote, the human does not find this remarkable. She has lived with it her entire life, and she describes it as simply doing the next thing. She does not understand that the next thing is exactly what has kept her kind alive, through everything the universe has put in front of them. She does not understand that what feels ordinary from inside her is the most extraordinary biological fact in the known galaxy. I do not think I will tell her. I think she is more useful to the universe not knowing. I think that is how the organ works best, quietly, without being admired. Just doing what it does when it is needed. He closed the log outside the window. The stars were very old and very far and had seen many things come and go in their long burning lifetimes. Species that rose and fell, civilizations that lit up the dark and then went quiet, worlds that bloomed and worlds that ended, and somewhere among them a small planet called Earth had produced a creature that kept getting up, not because it was the strongest, not because it was the smartest, not because it had calculated the best odds or been given the best gifts, but because somewhere in the quiet architecture of its body there was a small dark braided organ that nobody had ever noticed and nobody had ever named and nobody had ever thought to study. And when everything was at its worst, when the math said stop, when every signal in the body said this is the end, that organ would fire and the human would take one more step and then another until the impossible thing was done, and then they would ask for coffee and not think about it again. And that said the universe to itself in the language of stars and time and the long patient turning of galaxies, that is the most dangerous and beautiful thing I have ever made.